BlueDriver Nation, Jim and Chris back with you on a 2007 Honda Civic. Today we're going to tackle the starter motor. This starter motor is not very reliable on this car and it fails a lot. Chris?
This is not necessarily a hard job, but it's really tight, really cramped. I'd say this is probably one of the harder things to do in this car, but we'll show you a couple of tricks, we'll show you what angle to work at, and you'll be able to get it out.
Let's see how easy it is. These are the tools you need to change your starter.
The starter motor in this car is on the back of the engine, right in the center, about a foot or two off the ground, and pretty tight up against the firewall. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put the car up on a ramp. You could also put it up on jack stands, just make sure everything is properly supported, and because you're going to be working under the car and you want it to be safe. We're going to start by removing the exhaust segment that goes under the engine. This step isn't 100% necessary, but it does make it a lot easier, and it's going to make it a lot easier for us to show you what's going on. Two 15mm bolts on the front, 317 in the back. It'd be a really good idea if you sprayed them down some penetrating oil and then walked away for a while and came back. Alright, so we're going to remove these three 17mm nuts in the back. One little bit of advice, there's probably going to be a lot of rust and bits of metal and dirt falling down, so get some good safety glasses and keep them on. And there it is. Alright, we're under the car, underneath the oil pan. The first thing we need to do is remove this bracket, which is right up here. If you reach up through the wheel well, you can just touch it, and it's a little metal bracket that connects the intake manifold to the engine, just a little support. It's held on with two 10mm bolts and one 12mm bolt. It's super cramped down here, it's not easy to get a good shot of what we're trying to take off. I know it's a little hard to visualize, so here's something that'll make it a little bit easier to figure out what's going on. To get the two 10mm bolts on the intake manifold side off, I've got two long extensions, a U-joint, and a 10mm socket. You just thread it up through here, just between the subframe and the motor. You get it on both bolts from here, and then you could use a ratchet or an impact gun. There's one. Alright, now we're going to take the 12mm bolt off. The bolt is on this surface here, facing the back of the car. There are two ways to get it off. The first one, I'm going to try using a ratchet with a 12mm socket. You can come in through the wheel well. And it shouldn't be torqued too much. So you can get the socket on the bolt there, and then you can just remove it. If it is too tight, then we can use a couple of extensions and a U-joint to take it off with the impact gun. Once it's loose, you can also reach up through the wheel well on the passenger side, just past the power steering pump, and I'm going to remove that last bolt. And there's the bracket. Alright, it's time to disconnect the battery cable and the starter cable. You can get a really good view of these two connectors if you come back just behind the subframe, right where we disconnected the exhaust. One tip, it's a really good idea to get something to support your head. If you get something like a coolant bottle or a washer fluid bottle, it's just the right size that it'll support your head. You can see what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to wake up with an incredibly sore neck in the morning. So if you stick your arm up to the right of the exhaust through here, you can really reach the connectors. It's the easiest way to get to them. Here's the starter. This is the starter cable here. On the back is the battery cable. Now you might notice that these cables don't seem to be on brackets. It looks like at some point something rusted and was broken off. Normally you'd want to press that tab and pull up to get this cable out of the way, but I guess nature and salt already took care of that. So the tab to release this connector is on the very top. It's not the easiest thing to get to. You just got to squeeze your finger up between the intake manifold and the clip. So you can press down the tab and then pull on the wire. If you're lucky. It'll come off. It is possible, if you pull too hard, to accidentally pull the cable out of the connector. If you do, it's not the end of the world. Don't panic. You can just press it back in. The battery cable is just to the right and slightly behind the starter cable. It's covered in a protective rubber cap. You can use something like a pick, maybe a pair of needle nose pliers. Pliers are probably the best. There's a rubber cap over the battery cable. You might not be able to see it so well, but there's a tab just above it. You can get some needle nose pliers on it. Squeeze, and you can just peel the cap, exposing the battery cable. Just push it back, kind of wedge it out of the way. To disconnect the battery cable, we're going to use a ratchet, an extension, and a 12mm socket. You just come in through here, come in from the side. The cap's going to push on you a little bit, so you just kind of have to overpower it and get it in there. Now you can disconnect the battery cable. And there it is. We'll just put that aside. The first starter bolt is on the bottom. You can see it straight up through the subframe here, just next to the axle. It's 14mm. So I've got a 14mm socket, U-joint, a bunch of extensions, breaker bar, more extensions. You can come up through the subframe into the wheel well. Get on the bolt. Then you can drop down here and we're going to break that loose. And there's the first bolt. The second bolt is a bit tricky. It's about this long, so the head of the bolt is actually a little bit to the right of the end of the starter. If you look up just to the right of the oil pan, you look up through here, through the axle, you'll just be able to see it. I'm going to take it out with my monstrosity of extensions, U-joint, 14mm socket again. Coming in through the wheel well. I want a flashlight so you can see what you're doing. Then I got my breaker bar. coming up in between the subframe and the control arm. And alright, I've almost got it out there. This bolt is pretty hard to see. We couldn't really get a good shot of it, so we can't really show it to you too easily. I'll demonstrate where it is once we get it out. You can just see it if you're lying just slightly to the right and behind the oil pan up on this angle here. And you just kind of have to feel around, and eventually you'll get your hand on it. And here it is. Alright, so we're back in our comfortable spot. I've got my pillow. The motor's loose now, so I'm just going to reach up through here, one arm up underneath the subframe. I'm going to slide the motor out. Watch the brackets on the back. They can get caught up in the cables, and if they do, it's pretty hard to remove. So pull it out, swing it 90 degrees this way towards you. And here's the old starter. Here's the starter out of the car. The way we were lying, with our feet out under the hood, our head facing towards the back, this is how it was installed. This is the lower 14mm bolt. And then here's the long one. So this is why it was kind of hard to see. You can see it kind of comes out between the starter wire and the battery cable, and this is where we had our socket with the U-joint. This is our new starter. I'm just going to show you real quick how we'd test the old one when it came out, just to see whether it was working or not. I'm going to show you what should happen. So a starter's fairly simple. You've got a battery terminal and a starter cable. The battery terminal is connected to the battery. When you apply 12 volts to the starter terminal, basically closes a relay, and then the starter goes on. You can test it out by connecting the battery to the battery terminal, the ground to just the chassis, and then you can take a second battery cable. Not very much current's going to be going through this one, so it's not like we need a full-size battery cable. And you can just tap it off the connector for the starter, and you should see the gear start to spin and the solenoid will push it out. Keep your fingers clear. You do not want to get caught in there. And that's what a good starter looks like. Alright, we're putting the new starter in. Watch the brackets, they like to hook up on cables. You want your battery cable facing up. We're going to come up through the subframe. Your arm through here. Watch out for a few rusty bolts. They like to carve you up a little bit. Before you start trying to bolt it up, make sure your starter and your battery cables are accessible. They're not wedged somewhere behind it. Alright, we're going to loosely install the lower 14mm bolt. It's going to be loose enough that you'll still be able to wiggle the starter around, so you can just move it around a bit to line up the holes when you're putting the one in top. Alright, I've got it started, so I'm just going to zip it in with my impact gun. So leave it just a little loose for now. Now we're going to take our long bolt and we're going to thread it in the top. It's real hard to see what you're doing here, so you're probably just going to have to go by feel. If you put your left hand up through the subframe here, you should just be able to feel the hole on the top of the starter by reaching around the axle and up and over. If you have any trouble getting it to line up, just kind of jiggle the starter around a little bit. Once it's started, you can get a ratchet and a short extension on it. Alright, now that we got it started, I'm going to go back to my magical extension and U-joint combination. And now we're going to torque to 33 foot-pounds. I've still got my extensions in the wheel well. That's the top bolt done. And now we'll torque the bottom one to 33 foot-pounds as well. And the bottom one is way easier to torque up. Alright, now I'm going to connect the battery cable. Alright, so we're going to start with the battery lead. To make things easier, pry back on the rubber hood and just keep the cap back like that. Then we're going to come up, slide it onto the terminal on the starter. This only goes on one way. And you can't really see what you're doing, so you just kind of have to go by feel. Ah, that was fun. Now I'm going to put on the nut, 12 millimeters. Now give it a tug just to make sure that it's firmly in place. Alright, we're just going to snug that up. The torque spec is 7 foot-pounds. It's amazing, everything in this car is so easy to work on, and this is utter torture. Alright, I've got a pair of pliers, so I'm just going to pry that rubber cap back into place. Now we plug back in the starter cable. The tab faces up. Now we're putting the intake manifold bracket back on. We're going to start with the 12 millimeter bolt that goes onto the engine. So up through the wheel well. Left hand up through the subframe, over the axle, and you can just thread it in by hand. After the ordeal we just went through, this is the easiest thing on earth. And we'll leave that loose. Now for our two 10 millimeter bolts. This is almost relaxing after trying to get that battery cable back on. Alright, for the last time, we've got our extension monster, U-joint, 10 millimeter socket. We're going to torque the two 10 millimeter bolts to 7.2 foot-pounds. $17 foot-pounds for the 12 millimeter bolt. You might have a bit of a clearance issue with the axle, so you can actually go over it with an extension if you want. And now the exhaust goes back on. While you're at it, this might be a good time to replace some gaskets, maybe the bolts. Just, check things out, see if they're getting rusty. It might be a good time to do a bit of preventive maintenance on your exhaust. Torque the rear exhaust nuts to 25 foot-pounds. We're going to torque these to 16 foot-pounds. All right, let's hook up the battery. See if it worked. Good, I wasn't about to do that again. So there's one last thing. Because we disconnected the battery, there's a good chance the radio is going to be locked out. We've got another video that we'll link in the description down below, and that'll tell you how to get your code and how to unlock the radio and get music working again.
Okay, so not as easy as we hoped it was, not as accessible as we hoped it was, but hopefully this will save you a ton of time and a ton of money. And if it does, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, fear no fix.